Welcome everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I hope that you've all had a chance to see the Rorschach exhibition downstairs, and if you haven't afterwards, please stick around and we can have a walkthrough as well as join us in the reception that we'll be having. I'm Peter Galison. I'm director of the Collection of Historical Scientific Instruments here at Harvard, and I've been working with Marla and Rebecca Lemoff to curate a show on the development and controversies and cultural assimilation of the projective tests, including the Rorschach test, over the last 100 years. It's been a great privilege to work with Marla and Rebecca, and with the staff of the collection. The designers who worked on the show have done a spectacular job, and I'm very hopeful that you'll have a chance to see that. In the show itself, we tried hard to show this not as a debunking of a test, but not also as a simple repertorial exercise in which we brought particular tests in the way that they would be presented in a textbook, but to show something of the history, which includes controversy and includes a tremendous influence on the visual culture of the 20th century. Just to give one example, among artists, everyone from Andy Warhol on forward through Rosemary Truckle, and many in between have taken the test and its visual identity as a jumping off point to reflect on the nature of design and of subjectivity and of the relationship that the artist has to the image. It's been it's occurred in fiction, and as you know from The Watchmen, where one of the protagonists is known as Rorschach. So it's something that has been taken up in music and really throughout contemporary culture. But it's not just the Rorschach. There was an attempt beginning in the early part of the 20th century to make tests which would give a kind of objective assessment of subjectivity, to probe inside who we are, how we organize the world, our characteristic forms of perception, and to do that in a way that would be intercomparable among different people, and indeed even among different subcultures of a country like Switzerland, or among cultures in the world. So it had ab initio an interest to people studying the psychology of children, people studying psychiatric disorders, as well as an anthropological interest. It was part of expeditions all over the world throughout the mid-century. I know that Clifford Geertz, for instance, on his trips to Bali, had as one of his assignments the administration of the Rorschach. So it's something that has been built into the social sciences, the interpretive social sciences, over the course of many decades. And we wanted to bring that forward in a way that would foreground the very idea of projection. And so you'll see in the show movie projections, slide projections, projections from the web, projections through rear projection mirror systems, projections onto the floor. We're constantly interested in what it means to put images out there, because in a way what the Rorschach does is to tell us that we are, in a certain sense, projectors onto the world around us. It's a great privilege to have with us the panel assembled today, and not only my two co-curators, but also Greg Meyer and Steve Benke, who've consulted with us along the way. We were very concerned that we do the exhibit in a way that would be not only protective of issues like copyright, which we were consulted with our legal experts about that, but also we wanted to do it in a way that was ethically sensitive to the needs and standards of the psychological profession. So they were very helpful in talking to us about these matters, and they're both experts in the field, and I'll introduce them more as they come up, but it's a great honor to have them with us, and we look forward to the discussion today about how they understand not only the past, but the future of these projective tests. like to begin by inviting Marla Evie to come up, and she's going to start with a film clip from a fiction film, and then to use that as a starting point for her reflections on the history of the tests. Marla.
So thank you, Peter, and I have to say, first of all, it's been a great honor to be invited to work on this exhibit, which has been really thrilling to work on. Really a great experience. So I am a clinical psychologist, and while I have some museum background, primarily I'm a clinical psychologist, and in the interest of full disclosure, I have done many Rorschachs, but the reason I did many Rorschachs was that I used doing the Rorschach to pay for my psychoanalysis. So you can imagine a scene in which, for some period of time in my life, I was doing extensive amounts of projective tests, and then I would go lie on the couch and free associate to the experience of doing the tests, among other things. So that, in fact, I have for a long time had questions about exactly what are we up to here. And it's clear to me that doing a psychological test is very different than doing therapy, for instance, where I think transparency is more and more the order of the day, and testing isn't quite like that. And I was puzzling over, how does the public view these tests, for instance? How can we better understand when this technology came in, exactly how the public viewed the tests? And I wanted to get a sense for, what other people thought, in addition to my own uneasiness at times about being a tester in lots of different venues, nursing homes, hospitals, and all sorts of other places. So I discovered this film, which I imagine most of you haven't seen, called The Dark Mirror, which was made in 1946, and it was the first film really to use the Rorschach to any extent. In fact, so popular, big an idea was the Rorschach in this film that Universal Pictures, who was putting out the film, wanted to advertise the film using ink blots in the newspaper. So this is an example of using ink blots, but I think that there's something about this film, which is a film noir from director Robert Siodmak, who was definitely a master of film noir, and there's something about the plot of the film that I think resonates with some of the issues that I'm talking about with regard to the unease that one sometimes has doing projective tests. So let me tell you a little bit about this film. There are twins, both played by Olivia de Havilland, who later is in The Snake Pit. She was very into playing psychiatric roles during this period and actually made everyone in this film go see a psychiatrist as part of the film. But in any case, she is playing two twins, and they are kind of sharing a job and pretending to be the same person at times so they can share this job. And one of them is kills somebody, and the other one has an alibi. And so the police detective cannot arrest anyone, and he's stuck. Meanwhile, enter the psychologist, who actually also has an MD, and he is charged with the police detective, can't you find out which one of these two is the murderess? I really need to take care of this. The psychologist said, I don't really want to do this, and he said, look, one of the murderers may kill the innocent one, so he decides to pretend that he's studying twins, which he was already doing, actually. So therefore, he was going to get the data on the Rorschach on these two people. So I'm going to show this clip and see if you can tell which of the two twins, Terry or Ruth, is the likely murderess. And notice also the film technique of the two different characters. Notice where the camera zooms in and when it doesn't, because I think it's very interesting.
Why?
Why what?
Why do you say you like me best?
Because that's always the answer during office hours.
What's this one?
These are pictures of ink blots. Actually, the kind you probably made yourself when you were a child. Just blobs of ink in the paper folded over.
What's it for?
It's another way of examining personality. Now, I'm going to hand them to you one by one. And all you have to do is tell me what you see there. What it looks like to you.
Quickly?
If you see it quickly, sure. As soon as you make something out of it, you tell me, that's all. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Now face that way, please. Now, what does it look like to you?
Might be a mask. You see? The black slanting holes for eyes, heavy eyebrows, and pursed lips give it a fixed expression.
Anything else?
May I turn it?
Any way you wish.
This looks like the face of a white lamb with a black nose. It's got a mark on its forehead. It looks like a moth spreading its wings over a butterfly. Beneath its front paws are two men, face down, with their arms outstretched. It all seems symbolic of something. The lamb looks so innocent, but it has two men under its paws.
Symbolic of what?
The lamb of death? I wonder if you're really as cool as you pretend.
Oh, no, I'm not.
I don't think so either.
Outside the office, I'm Robert Taylor with Jet Propulsion. What do you see in this one? What does it look like to you, Terry?
These are two men, back to back, but they don't seem to be aware of each other. Now it's changing into the full face of a man with drooping mustache and slanting eyes. This is a dancer, a woman, dancing with a puppet. Now you see the puppet reaching to pat a cruel rival that pretends not to see her. But all the time he's trying to reach near enough to do her some harm. May I have a cigarette, please?
By the way, why'd you leave Nebraska, Ruth?
Well, we've been living on this farm for about a year, and the farmer's wife wanted to adopt me legally. The doctor said she couldn't have any children, but they could only afford to adopt one of us.
Why'd they pick you instead of Terry, do you know?
Oh, just happened, I suppose. No particular reason. There's not much choice between twins, you know. But Terry was very upset when she heard about it naturally, so we just decided to pull out, that's all.
What do you see in this one?
Well, these are two people in costume, and they're dancing around a maypole. They're bending over because they've just about wound up the ribbons. Is that what you want?
That's it. Anything else? Turn it if you wish.
These are two skaters, like in the ice show. And they're leaning backward, with 1 foot high in the air, and their arms extended.
How did Terry find out, do you know?
Oh, the farmer, I think. He never liked it from the beginning for some reason.
Is he cranky?
No, I got along fine with him, but Terry, for some reason...
What do you see in this one?
Oh, these are two old ladies sitting back to back in an open streetcar, like the old cable cars in San Francisco, and they seem frightened. They're holding onto their arms of their chairs with their hands. They've got their feet tucked tightly under their seats. And look at those chins. And this is a drum majorette with a high bearskin shako. And she's very straight and graceful, light-footed, and she's got her knee high in the air.
Thank you very much.
The reason it's interesting is that there's clearly a distinction between these two women, one being more insane, and in fact he goes on to score it, and you see him scoring it in the movie, and then you see him talking to the police detective, one of our young ladies is insane. So that he goes about selecting the person based on his scoring of the Rorschach, and is looking very scientific, and yet there's a lot of duplicity in this film, in the sense that he's not telling them what he's really doing. He's denying that he's working with the police. The twins themselves are deceptive by one pretending to be the other, or covering up the alibi for the other. And the film goes on with one series of deceptive acts after another. Some of the criticism and commentary about this film also gets to other issues about duplicity in the sense of the doppelganger, two visions of women that men might have from a feminist perspective. The mirror takes on an importance here in terms of dark shadows in the film noir tradition. But in general, I think the word duplicity is really interesting here, because I think it conveys a sense in some ways of a need for a tester in this situation perhaps to be a little bit two-faced, in the sense that one is trying to be genuine with the patient and at the same time oftentimes has institutional loyalties, perhaps to an inpatient unit or perhaps in a forensic situation, so that it's a complicated blend of deception that I don't think obtains in psychotherapy in quite the same way. And I think that lots of times too, the wish, there's this strong imperative for the psychologist to do what this psychologist does, which is to say, I know what the story is, I know what certitude is here. I can tell you one is insane, one is not, here's the one, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things I've discovered teaching projective tests for a long time is that owning too much certainty in this field is exactly the wrong thing to do. I think that in some sense, the whole projective method calls for a lot of hubris on the part of the psychologist, and I think that's where the Rorschach has gotten into trouble a bit, is that people say that it can do more than it can do, and are not acknowledging its limits, so that in fact, if one is to be a good psychologist, you have to be both an owner of certainty and at the same time very cautious about what the limits of the instrument are. And I think that that's one of the things that I think I've discovered in doing it, but also I think this film gets to the issue of how much kind of hidden agendas there might be in testing. And in fact, as one looks at the history of testing, there have been congressional hearings about the use of the MMPI and various other things like this, partly because there's this worry in the public, I think, of one's privacy being invaded. And in the end, those hearings basically said only psychologists who have skills should be doing this and only under certain circumstances. So it's not an entirely benign procedure, but I do think that there's this kind of uneasiness about testing, and so that's basically my point that I wanted to mention. So.
Next is Greg Meyer will be speaking, and he's editor of the Journal of Personality Assessment.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I thought I would just make a few opening remarks in talking about the evolution of the ink blots and some of the implications that this has for us understanding the projective process and how to consider the Rorschach as a projective instrument. And Rorschach was an artist. He trained as an artist. His father was an artist, and he was particularly interested, not so much in ink blots per se, but he was interested in things that suggested different possibilities. He was interested in competing images, and he had a particular knack for creating some competing images. His early artwork, and this is drawn from the archives, the Rorschach archives in Bern. This is an example of one of his competing visual stimuli. It's a squirrel and it's also a rooster. And so if you attend to the color, you attend more to the roosterness of the image, and if you attend to the shape, you're attending more to the squirrelness of the image. And so this is one illustration. Here's an alternative. And here it's either a leopard frog that has somewhat a shape of a cat, or it's a cat who has an incongruous color to his body. So Rorschach was very intrigued by these kinds of images, and he actually built this into the test. The Rorschach is by design, by his design, it's a test of incomplete competing visual stimuli. There are all kinds of stimuli that are suggestive of certain things, but none of them are perfect or precise, and so they're all incomplete in some ways. The idea of these competing images is something that intrigues psychology in general, and so we have, I should say I'm a clinical psychologist by training. We have an interest in psychology in reversible figures, and this figure here of either a vase or two faces. One of my favorite examples of how this plays out is in this logo for the Pittsburgh Zoo, which is a bit Rorschach-ish. And so it's either a rather beautiful tree, or you can also see in there the outline of the gorilla on the left and the lioness on the right, and then also the fish at the bottom of the image. And I don't have a pointer, but can you all see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so they're in profile.
Yeah.
The gorilla's in profile, facing towards the tree, and the lioness is facing towards the tree from the other side. I think they found out that people were having a hard time getting their logo, so they have versions of their logo that actually have ears in them and eyes, so that you can more clearly see the animals in there. Anyway, so how does this play out in the Rorschach and in the ink blots that he created? Well, one of the ways that it plays out is through the iterative process that Rorschach took in developing the ink blots. So he didn't, in contrast to what was said in the film clip, these are not just blobs placed on a piece of paper and the paper folded over. That is the design that's used, the mechanism of doing it, but Rorschach did not do these accidentally. So this is an image of card 3, and this is the final version of card 3. But he started off with alternative images, and I'm not sure of the sequence, but I'm going to give you several different alternative versions. This one, you could just make out the two outside red pieces and the center red, but it's got a very different configuration than what he ended up with. Now what Rorschach did is he pilot tested these. He drew these, then he worked with them with his patients, and he found out what elements of the stimulus were pulling for different kinds of responses, and he accentuated the stimuli to develop different elements, or to provide more of a balance of the kinds of things that he was looking for, more evocativeness. So this is a third iteration of that image that, in the end, again, becomes this image here. Another example of that would be to look at card 10. So this is the most colorful of the ink blot images, and the most sort of energetic in some ways. And one of the early versions of that is this iteration here. Again, it's a very different kind of visual composition, one that you can see the elements that are present in the final image, the blue in the upper outer areas and the red in the center. But clearly it has different shapes, and it elicits different kinds of responses. An alternative is this version here, which is taking on more of the structure of the final version, which again is this image here. So my point is that these stimuli, these were not accidental images, as Rorschach himself referred to them, but they're very deliberate images that were created to have this evocative potential and to present us or present test takers with these multiple competing images, all of which are suggestive of certain things, none of which are definitive of anything. And so the 10 ink blots that he ended up selecting for use in the test, they have these qualities that in my estimation, that they carry these qualities much better than any of the other alternative ink blots that are out there. And I think that the reason that the Rorschach ink blots have captured the imagination of psychologists as much as they have, and have been used as frequently as they have, as opposed to the Holtzman ink blots or the Romer ink blots or the Ben Rorschach ink blots, is because of what he built into these stimuli and the trial and error process that went into it. His effort was to build in for each card, was to have some common detail areas where people would land on those details visually, and it would suggest something to them. It would be evocative of a certain kind of thing. So if we go back to look at card 3, it's particularly easy to see here. We have what looks like a butterfly in the center of the image, and two people outside of the butterfly. This image was obviously a little bit different in the movie clip that Marla showed us. They had Dr. Anyway, what that does is it brings a certain structure to the test. This figure here will take a little bit of time to digest, but this figure is a figure that describes the frequency with which objects are seen in a normative sample. This is a normative sample from Brazil, and this is the number of objects that were identified in that normative sample. They had 6,400 and some odd objects that were identified in that sample by the 600 people that were participating in this normative study. So the horizontal axis goes from 1 to 6,400 and whatever. And these are our ranks on the bottom of the graph there on the x-axis. On the y-axis, the vertical axis, is how often people identified that particular object. Okay? So there's one object in this database that about 370 people saw. 370 out of the 600 people. There's another object, it's hard to see, that was seen by about 300 people. Okay. One of the things that's notable is that there's no object that's seen by 600 people. There's nothing in these ink blots where everybody looking at the card sees the same thing. That doesn't happen at all. And this is true not just in this Brazilian sample, but it's true in all other samples as well. Now the interesting thing about this, though, is to get down to the frequency of 50, where 50 people out of 600 are seeing the object. How many objects do you think that might entail, getting down to that point there? So again, the top of this arm on the left-hand side, the top of that is indicating that there's one object that's being seen by 370 people. Okay. Then below that are other objects that are being seen by less often by people. They're being seen 300 times, or 250 times, or 200 times, or 150 times. Any guesses how many objects are getting encompassed down to that point where 50 people out of 600 are seeing the same thing? 30. There's only 30 objects that show up with that degree of regularity, where 50 or more people are seeing those objects. To get down to the curve where the graph bends, we're at 270 objects. So what this is indicating is that there is a high degree of structure built into the test. There is this arm here on the left-hand side is the stuff that Rorschach put into the test. It's the bats and the butterflies that are there evocatively by design. They're the easy things to see. They're what makes conventional perception conventional. What stretches off on the x-axis is the rich ideographic tale of the Rorschach. They're the unique images that nobody else sees. It's kind of hard to decipher here, but if you go from about 1,000, a rank of about 1,000 to about 2,000, you're looking at objects that are seen by two people, the same object seen by two different people. The rest of those, going from about 2,000 out to 6,400, those objects are only seen by one person. So these are unique objects that are seen by one person, not by others. Now the interesting thing about this database, and it's true for all the databases that identify the frequency of objects, is that most of the objects that people report are on that left-hand arm. And so the total number of responses in this database is about 14,000 responses. The vast majority of them are on this left-hand side. They're the things that are being seen by multiple people multiple times. So the test has more structure, if you will, built into it than it does have this ideographic versions. Now this is a funny distribution. This is a distribution that's known as a Zif distribution, named after the linguist whose first name is escaping me right now. Anyway, this is a distribution that shows up with various kinds of natural phenomena. It shows up with earthquake intensity. It shows up with populations of villages and cities. You have mega cities, the really big ones, and then you have a whole bunch of small towns, but very few mega cities. It shows up with the distribution of wealth. and a variety of other things. There's a curious, most of us are on the low end, the common low end. Anyway, and Rorschach objects adopt this frequency as well. Now, for my way of thinking, that has some implications for how we think of this as a projective test. And John Exner, who did a lot to systematize Rorschach-based assessment, wrote a very compelling article that was titled "Searching for Projection in the Rorschach." And his point was that there's not a lot of projection present in Rorschach responses. That in fact, a lot of what goes into Rorschach responses is organizing information, classifying information, deciphering what is there, and figuring out the signal relative to the noise. This idea that the Rorschach is a projective test comes from Frank in 1939. And his idea, I split this quote from him up into 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph there is getting at what the Rorschach shares with the thematic apperception test or with figure drawing tasks, other kinds of so-called projective tests, where we're inducing the person to reveal his or her way of organizing information, putting together the world, imposing their schema on the tasks that we're presenting them with. The bottom part, though, is where we get into trouble. And the bottom part of this hypothesis suggests that the important and determining process is the subject's personality, which operates on the stimulus situation as if it had a wholly private significance for him alone, or an entirely plastic character, which made it yield to the subject's control. So this idea that we're going to impose our internal processes on the external environment no matter what, that actually doesn't square with the data, and it doesn't square with what Rorschach put into the ink blots. So there's that idea it sort of takes this a little bit too far. And it left myself and a colleague of mine suggesting that it's time for us to be thinking of better terminology to characterize our instruments for assessing personality. And there's been this dichotomy historically in personality assessment measures where we had objective tests, which were self-report inventories, basically, in contrast to projective tests. And in part because we see this very clear structure in the Rorschach, we're suggesting that we need a term that allows for projection to be present when it is present, but also allows us to understand the structure that is evident in the ink blots as well. So, those are my thoughts for getting us started.
I have the pleasure to introduce our colleague, Rebecca Lemoff, who is working in the history of the interpretive social sciences.
So I'm interested in, I'm going to take a different tack from Greg and talk more tell you a little bit about how I got interested in projective tests, which comes from anthropology. And I'm trained as an anthropologist, and at some point, and I've also become a historian, and I'm interested also in the history of psychology. So projective tests were kind of a natural place I discovered where these interests converge. And I was struck when doing historical research at statements made around the middle of the 20th century by people like S.F. Nadel, very eminent anthropologists in the UK or in the US, who would say things like, I'm paraphrasing, but things like, an anthropologist cannot possibly go into the field anymore without carrying the Rorschach and the TAT in his kit bag, along with his mosquito netting and his other instruments and his pad of paper and field notes. So it became, this is actually a dramatic way of putting it, but it actually was a very thriving movement that many of the most innovative anthropologists and psychologists joined in to around, I'd say the prime years of the projective test movement in anthropology were probably around 1945 to 1963 or so, but it extended into the 70s in the iteration I'm talking about, which was part of culture and personality. So I thought I would start with a particular image. And this is, I think this one is in the show. It's from the Pacific Island version of the thematic apperception test, which was Henry Murray's test developed at Harvard in the 1930s. And this test was used as part of the 1947 to 48 coordinated investigation of Micronesian anthropology, which was hailed by the United States Navy, which collaborated in funding it, as the most complete study ever attempted of a given place and its peoples. And it was meant to delve not only to study the cultural forms on every island in Micronesia, but also to delve into the inner life and use psychological tests to create a large database of people's subjective states of mind. And so they not only gave the standard Rorschach test, but they also gave the standard Murray TAT from Harvard, and they also developed a local version of the test to be more sensitive to cultural differences. And so as a result, there arose a set of 14 specially adapted TAT cards geared to life on tropical atolls. And the tropical test, it sounds, some part of it is, doesn't translate today precisely as it was intended to, but the tropical test cards steered, topically they steered well away from the standard TAT, which involved, so this is card number 2, which was meant to evoke a potential attack or a rape that was about to take place. At least that's what the anthropologist said. And they hired an artist in Chicago to render these drawings in a way that they thought would evoke and sort of stimulate South Pacific Islander. This is just an example of a Murray TAT card, the kind that they thought wouldn't necessarily translate. They were full of these heavy emotional scenes that were quite existential. Also, Marla's film kind of captures that existential mood that descends on the TAT test. So there's quite a different style, too, of just pen work. And in addition, they were curious about views about homosexuality, for example. Was it universally seen as pathological or not? So this card was specifically designed to show two men sitting on a log who were clearly expressing, according to the anthropologist William Lessa, some sort of libidinal interest in each other. But it turned out that most Pacific Islanders on Ulithi and Yap and other islands where they were given did not see a libidinal act about to take place. They thought that the two men were discussing a storm, or they were brothers, or sometimes they would just say, there are two men here. Sometimes there would be a lot of resistance to taking the test in the first place, they discovered. So, for example, the anthropologist Mel Spiro gave this test. And I should just mention very quickly that these islands were under U.S. occupation and had just been won from the Japanese in fierce fighting after World War II. So there was rapid change taking place on the islands to begin with. Many times they had never seen an American before. An anthropologist walked up to them and handed them a test. Sometimes they had never been exposed to American movies, but they were starting to be shown widely on the islands. And there was sort of a moment at which there was a cultural encounter going on, and the tests were almost like ambassadors of that encounter. But Micronesians tended not to interpret the cards in the way that was expected at all, and sometimes the data sets were then criticized for that reason, that not seen as very rich, or the Micronesians were seen as not having a very rich inner life. Micronesian says, and so there was an impasse, and sometimes the fact that they would count the people or the figures or the plants in the card would be said to represent an enumerative tendency in Micronesians and a lack of emotional depth. Mm-hmm. And so, as the anthropologist Peter Black has noted, it may well be that the absence of psychological anthropology from the social science writings of Micronesian scholars is related to the widely known distaste with which many Micronesians view the output of the Culture and Personality School when applied to their own societies. Nevertheless, the fact of that absence is disturbing. What's interesting is that there were data sets such as Lessa's modified TATs of 99 Ulethian males and females, Spiro's 156 Rorschach's, 126 modified TATs, and 83 Stewart emotional response tests, as well as 82 Bavalas moral ideological tests, and 54 dreams. So these are just two of many data sets that were collected and stored in a National Science Foundation funded project that I'm currently writing about. And this vast array of psychological materials was stored for the last 60 years in the Library of Congress, and it amounts to about 20,000 pages of data in response to these kinds of projective tests, and also includes many dreams. And so I'll just end by, I find this data very rich, and I don't find it to be somehow just the product of some kind of epistemological naivete, but actually, I'll end by saying what I think is interesting about it. But I wanted to answer the question, if anyone had it, of who was the first person to take the Rorschach and the TAT into the field, and who had that idea? I mean, we often hear about it, the development by Rorschach, the way the test came to America, carried by Klopfer, the way people were trained, but who was the first person who thought we should give it to quote-unquote primitives? And I mean, well, actually, there's a longer story to this, but the simplest story is that the anthropologist Irving Hallowell, who had recently been converted to anthropology, was basically at a New York seminar in the mid-1930s on the effects of personality on culture, where he was sitting next to Ruth Benedict, and she started talking about this amazing test called the Rorschach, and he was struck by this name, and he thought the test offered a lot of possibilities, and he decided he would just take it out to the field and test it with Ojibwa Indians in the Barrens River Salto along the river. And so he took the test with him. He traveled, and he found several settlements of Ojibwa Indians. And the basic, by 1940, he collected a full series of 151 protocols covering men, women, boys, and girls in 2 different settlements. Essentially, one was downriver and one was upriver. And what he generalized from these was that the people downriver were more acculturated. They were more used to contact with white society. They had more or less of an Ojibwa kind of traditional way of life, whereas upriver they were less quote-unquote contacted. And he also found that he felt that their Rorschach results correlated to that level of contact. He felt that the people upriver were well-adjusted and better adjusted, and the people downriver showed more disturbance and more evidence of acculturative forces. And so, meanwhile, although Hallowell is often credited as the pioneer of the Rorschach, and many emulated him, taking the Rorschach and the TAT, technically others preceded him, including Jules Henry, who gave the test to Pulaga Indians in 1936 and 1937 in the Argentine Gran Chaco, and also Theodore Abel, who gave the test in 1938. So I'll just give you, this is just subject 139 from that. These standard protocols were gathered. This is the record of subject 139 who took this test. So conclusions or just thoughts I would leave you with. As I said, I find this data very rich, and it testifies, first of all, to just how proliferative these tests were. There wasn't just the Rorschach or just the TAT. They seemed to inspire people to create alternate versions that could travel, versions that could, a little bit like maybe the way that Michel Foucault describes the panopticon. It can take root in different environments and could be repurposed and multi-purposed. Secondly, that they're proliferative not only geographically, but in terms of the theories or the ideas that could be tested by means of them. For example, anthropologists wanted to use the test to quantify or standardize culture itself, to assess how acculturation worked. How did people, in their view, seem to lose their soul, the soul or the warrior culture or whatever made them distinctive, a certain way of life? Could you track that by using the Rorschach test? Could you mark the moment at which a cultural tradition was extinguished as represented in the test? And so the data it still exists. And the third thing that they really wanted to do was just amass a vast repository of subjective data that had never been rivaled, and which they did succeed in doing for the time before the electronic database was available, and they microcarded these results. And they very specifically thought that at some point in the future, people would be able to use the data to ask questions that no one had ever yet thought of. And so as a 1961 edited volume bemoaned the dearth of adequate empirical materials descriptive of personality processes in the world's cultures. And to some extent, that goal is still, revivable. And third, I'm just interested in this famous image of these tests as X-rays of the inner life. For example, Henry Murray said, these tests, as a rule, the subject leaves the test happily unaware that he has presented his psychologist with what amounts to an X-ray picture of the inner self. In other words, the person wouldn't know it, but they had actually revealed him or herself. And this seems, in the case of the Micronesian or the Ojibwan materials, not to be the case. I think it would be far-fetched to claim that was going on at all, but what you do see is an X-ray picture of that encounter, of that. So the projective device kind of work as projections into history or reverse projective devices so that we can see this moment at which test takers and test givers were in a kind of strange relationship and a rich relationship to each other. So I think I'll leave it there.
Stephen Benke has held many posts, but he's in charge of ethics at the American Psychological Association, and he has a background both in law and psychology. His interests cross those different domains, law, ethics, and psychology, in fascinating ways. It's a great pleasure to welcome him here.
Thank you very much. And I'd really like to thank Peter and Marla and Rebecca for including me in the panel. I will speak very briefly from my perspective as director of the ethics office at the American Psychological Association, share some thoughts with you, and then if that's an interest, if the ethical aspects are of an interest, we can speak about those more. I would like to recognize, as I start off, Dr. June Wolfe, who served on the APA Ethics Committee and has certainly been thinking about these issues for a long time. APA's first ethics code was written in 1953, and there is a section in the code that addresses assessment. And actually, today, it is that section of the ethics code that probably gives us in the ethics office the majority of our work. And I want to quote Marla, who I thought had a very nice turn of phrase when she said that these tests are not an entirely benign procedure. And I think Marla elaborated the notion of dual roles and the certainty with which we psychologists have provided their findings, and Rebecca calling attention to the subject who is happily unaware, in Henry Murray's words. So from the ethics perspective, what we try to do is to think about where are the possible harms in administering these tests. And if we take a look at the standards in the ethics code, that's what the standards are directed to address. So that we have standards such as who is qualified to give the tests, and when is a psychological test outdated or obsolete, and a lot of attention to disclosures of material related to psychological testing and who has access to those materials. Now, when Peter and Marla and Rebecca first approached me, that was actually one aspect of the exhibit that we addressed most directly, because they talked about wanting to use actual Rorschach images in the exhibit. So we wanted to think about, well, what are the ethical aspects of that? To me, that is a very interesting question. In the ethics code, we have an ethical standard on maintaining test security. The reason that standard is there is that the more these tests are available to test takers, that can compromise the test validity. So we pay a lot of attention to how can we protect test security. We live now in an age, however, in which these tests are widely available. Some of you may be aware about the controversy when the folks on Wikipedia made the Rorschach available. We have seen tests in film clips, and I think if you go down to the exhibit, when you go down to the exhibit, you will see how widely these images are now available in even the popular media, including video games. So for us, as we take a look at the relevant sentence, it says psychologists make reasonable efforts to maintain the integrity and security of test materials and other assessment techniques. So our question then becomes, well, what measures are reasonable for psychologists when these materials are so available publicly? How do we think about that, and how do we act in an appropriate way? I think that brings a very interesting relationship into play between the ethical and the clinical, because as we think about what reasonable steps psychologists ought to take to protect the materials, then we turn to the clinical folks and say, well, what effect does this have on you as you administer these tests? Because previously, when you have an assumption that a subject would not have been exposed to the Rorschach, in certain settings now, one almost, it seems to me, has to bring in precisely the opposite assumption, that they very likely will have had at least some exposure to the cards. So how does one address that shift in assumptions in a clinical way? So that is what I had to say from the perspective of ethics, and certainly if that's something that interests people, we can talk about that more. Thank you.
Our last speaker, my colleague and friend Ann Harrington, has been thinking about the history of psychology for a very long time.
A year or two.
Written in ways that have really reshaped our understanding of the history of the discipline. But today I've asked if Ann might think a little bit about how one might embed the various contexts of the history of projective testing in some of the realms of thought with which she's familiar.
There have been ways that implicitly or explicitly the Rorschach test has already been embedded by previous speakers in certain kinds of histories. It's part of the history of the interpretive social sciences, part of the history of psychology, including, although it wasn't explicitly mentioned, like the Gestalt psychologists or people like Necker who are interested in these competing images. And there's other histories that if we had had more speakers, we might have also agreed were, of course, part of the history. And one it would be the history that led to the making of the tests that take us back to Switzerland, the late 19th century, early 20th century. The Burgholzli, which was at the time, not only the leading psychiatric hospital in Switzerland and one of the leading psychiatric hospitals in Europe, but it also was the hotbed for the new Freudian ideas. In some sense, you could argue that it was more important than Vienna. Certainly for the infiltration of psychoanalytic thinking into psychiatry as opposed to sort of the psychoanalysis as a little sort of tribe of people who were developing their own institutions. And so you could think about Rorschach there. You could think, because he comes to the Burgholzli, he knows Bleuler, Eugen Bleuler, who is the one that draws Freudian ideas into psychiatry. You could think about Carl Gustav Jung running around developing word association tests, and you could think about the relationships between what Jung is doing and what Rorschach is doing and what Bleuler is trying to do. You could even, if you wanted, expand your thinking about this kind of history to take into consideration the fact that there was an awful lot of interest in the art of the mentally ill at the Burgholzli, and they were busy having the patients sort of giving them oil paints and sort of putting up the paintings to see what light this might shine on their inner world. So there was an interest in the inner world at the Burgholzli. There were tests and various technologies that were being developed to make sense of this, and Rorschach seems logically and sensibly to be part of it, and I'm sure that's right. But what if there was even more to say? What if that's kind of a known or could be easily known and accepted history. But what if you broadened even further, I was thinking, and Peter took me down and we were sort of looking at the exhibits, and I began to think about sort of the techniques of juxtaposing. You can juxtapose that history, exhibits juxtapose, but what if you imagine juxtaposing another history? Alongside the Burgholzli history, the psychoanalysis history, and this would be the history of the occult, the history of interest in spiritualism, the interest in divination, like the I Ching, or gazing into tea leaves,
Or the tarot.
well, and all of the degrees to which there were technologies of the occult sciences that were of enormous interest to people in Switzerland as well as in Europe more broadly, into which the Rorschach test or these ink blots played a role. And what if you then began to think about the fact that Justinus Kerner, who is known to be one of the people who had a direct lineage influence on Rorschach, what if you considered the fact that he was actually, a spiritualist? And when he looked at these blots, as he did, he tended to see not an X-ray of his own soul, what he thought he was doing was finding a way to connect to spirits. And finding a way to connect, and others who were interested in these blots thought they were finding a way to connect to the world's soul. And what if you began to then, if you juxtaposed the medical history, the psychology history, the social science history alongside these other histories, how might you then start to think about other things that you might not have thought were part of your story? Like other technologies. You have the word association test, you have the TAT, you have the Rorschach, and that's all in the exhibit. But what about the I Ching? What about the planchette? The precursor to the Ouija board. What about then things that get like the tarot cards? I'm interested. So my thought or contribution here is to invite us to loosen up a little bit, or to broaden out a little bit, to imagine ways in which some of these more subterranean histories might actually fruitfully open up what we might find interesting, culturally interesting and relevant about Rorschach, beyond seeing it as an important tool for doing the good work of the social sciences and of the clinic. So I think I'll leave it with that.
That's great. Thank you. I had some thoughts about directions that one might pursue if we were to look at some of Anne's very interesting provocation to expand into the domain of the mystical. One thought was that Rorschach himself, from the very beginning, in fact from before the beginning of the canonization of the cards, was interested in the occult in Switzerland. Because there were very strong cult movements in Switzerland, and he was very much aware of them. And he had a theory, in fact, a sort of psycho-sociological theory that cults preferentially formed at the boundary point between regions of cultural homogeneity. So when you had these collisions, he thought that's where you found the cults. And he had many examples from small Swiss cults that had formed up in that way. The second is that through the thematic apperception test than through Rorschach, clearly there's this very strong tie to Jung. And through Jung's word association test, but also through, more importantly, through Jung's own quite mystical views about sort of world concepts and collective unconscious and many other things that he borrowed very explicitly from an amalgam of Swiss-mediated Eastern beliefs, and that really, does shape, and you can see in the exhibit actually some clues as to where one might dig if one wanted to pursue this very interesting suggestion. But through that, the use then of Christiana Morgan's images in not only inspired by Jung, she was his patient, but also he then used both her and her images as in pursuing his vision seminars and so on, which were famously not exactly aligned with medico-biologistic models of Sigmund Freud. And finally, the Swiss Psychoanalytic Association, in which Rorschach and Morgenthau, his friend, played very important roles, were very conscious of trying to pull together the disparate psychological movements, psychiatric movements. And I think that Switzerland, by both the smallness and its internal diversity, but it's also its adjacency linguistically and culturally with so many other places, was very aware of not wanting to be subordinate to a strong Bloilerian, Jungian, or Freudian, or other psychiatric movements. So the society itself, which played such a strong role, and as some of you have mentioned, was partly shaped by its own mediative positioning. That seemed to me very intriguing. But which brings me to a question that I think you've all addressed in different ways. But what happens to these tests when they're taken out of their, what's the fate of this out of Western Europe, United States context? I mean, I know, Rebecca, you've been looking at the design of these other tests, like the one that you showed, and I know that all three of you, Greg, Steve, and Marla, have thought about these tests and their recent fate, or where they're headed now. To what, I mean, they were designed to a certain degree, these picture tests, to deracinate them from a particular inquiry, the way the 19th century tests said, do you know what this toaster is for? I mean, things that were so manifest, or questions about baseball in some of the intelligence tests that were available in the years running up to World War I. There was such a, these tests were designed to try to get out of that manifest cultural specificity. What's happened to them over time? Do you have thoughts about that in their international usage or application?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, Greg might have more information about the use of cross-cultural materials now. But I think it's interesting that, in a sense, I saw them as, I got really interested in situations of administration of tests, and I mean, Rorschach and Marie and others were quite specific about how a test should be administered, and they didn't envision it being given, for example, on horseback or in on the beach somewhere. I mean, Rorschach just wanted cross-cultural testing, and he envisioned tests of African and different cultural groups as well as different cantons of Switzerland. But he didn't. I mean, I'm sure he never imagined that Navajo Indians would be tested in a bar off Route 69 with the anthropologist paying them by beer per test. And there's highly irregular situations, but in a sense, what you also observe is the regularization of the test giving procedure to people who are not at all used to taking tests, in the sense that this is what one does, like at a certain point. I found that them to be almost ritualized encounters of teaching children, women, and men about what it means to take a test, and kind of that happening at the moment, right on the cusp of decolonization.
What have you learned about how people dealt with language issues?
Well, it is an interesting question, and the people administering the test weren't naive about the effects of translation. Often it was necessary to have a translator because.
So there were people in those Micronesian islands who could speak English?
They would find the one person who, to some degree, spoke a bit of English because of, maybe there was often one person who spoke a little bit, but often that person had, as they admitted, an odd personality, or was not the most reliable. For example, I recently showed an anthropologist who's worked in Micronesia. I showed him my data, and he's like, I would never trust any of the translations of this. He was a notoriously odd person, the translator himself. So that a lot was riding on the authority of the translator, the ability to translate the remarks of a psychotic. So that was that was talked about a lot, and it was considered better if you didn't need to use a translator. For example, Jules Henry had a gift with languages, and he could just go to Pilaga and pick up the language in a couple months, and then give the test to every villager he found. So, and there's also the question of visual translation as well.
I asked Clifford Geertz once what it was like administering the test, and he said, well, we were on this trip, we had all these things we were going to do, and I was very excited. I was going to administer the Rorschach test. We got to Bali, and I took out the test, and I showed the first picture just to a person there, and I said, what's this? And I was very pleased that it was not going to have any cultural specificity, and he said, oh, well, that's a such and such fly. And then he said he realized he had no idea what this fly was, what it signified. Was it poisonous? Was it auspicious? Was it imaginary? Was it mystical? So it's true the picture doesn't itself demand that you know what stealing third baseman, but it at the same time it leaves open what those responses signify. But you were going to say something maybe about your experience in looking at test responses over quite a variety of cultures.
One of the things that we know from a research perspective is we've got a lot of data on Rorschach protocols from different cultures. And a lot of this was published in 2007. What the data that's been collected so far shows is that for adults, people look very similar to each other. There are more differences on Rorschach scores. There are more differences for two samples collected from the same country than there are across different countries, for the countries that are represented. Now, this doesn't speak to the issue of, the kind of cultural icons that are present in the culture. And so the Christmas elves in Finland, which, don't really resonate with us, or some of the imagery from other cultures that they're embedded in that culture, but they don't generalize. The kinds of things that do generalize, though, are the codes and the scores and the way that we classify the information from the behaviors that people have, what they attend to in the Rorschach, how well they perceive images, how conventional their perceptions are. Those kinds of things show a remarkable degree of cross-cultural generality.
This is something that the ethics code addresses in talking about using assessment instruments whose validity and reliability have been established for use with members of the population tested. And I think it would be actually interesting, I've never done it, but I think it would be interesting to see how the field's thinking and understanding of that has changed, developed over time. And I think what people have understood, and again I'm going to quote Marla's, this is not an entirely benign procedure, and I think one of the things that people have understood over time is the harms that can come from the inappropriate use of assessment techniques in this manner. And I think we've become much more sensitive over time to that.
Well, one other thing I would mention is that I think there's been a movement in psychology, particularly with intelligence tests, to have a culture-free measure. And sometimes I think the Rorschach is perceived this way, that it's something that would be similar across cultures, et cetera. But in fact, as we learn more about things like Asperger's and all sorts of other and right hemisphere learning disabilities, we're understanding that in fact one of the things you want to measure is someone's attunement to the culture. So that in fact it's appropriate and necessary to have personality measures in particular that are very culture specific. You have to have them. So that makes it very complicated with something like the TAT, which was made in the 30s, basically, and published in the 40s, to use now, when it doesn't have quite so much relevance. But the reason the TAT has lasted so long is that it's really wonderfully drawn. Christiana Morgan was an artist, and she, if you take a look at the exhibit, you'll notice that she takes drawings and then simplifies them and makes them more ambiguous at the same time, so that actually, just like Rorschach, she evokes such a range of possible responses. I don't think people necessarily appreciate when they come up with new versions of the TAT how artfully this was done, and I think that's one of the dilemmas in creating a test. So that's another side point, but I think it's important.
So yeah, I liked Rebecca's, obviously working with Anne and Rebecca, but the idea that tests that were designed to get rid of context, either cultural or institutional, and to travel well, kind of rediscover their limitation in the conditions of administration. So when they, so it becomes kind of all those kind of practical or technical problems, or having inappropriate subjects, inappropriate culturally or either responses or behavior. So I find that very interesting in how those kind of tests that are in themselves in the history of the human and social sciences designed as imperialist tools that are supposed to garner universality, kind of discover their own, the inner contradictions, and they're dependent on material conditions and social circumstances. The one thing that I was wondering if the curators of the exhibition would want to comment on. But why was the visual reasoning considered so compelling over any other kind of form of reasoning in psychological tests? I mean, of course, I think Anne's ideas suggest that there's ideas of symbolic representation that are collected and
I think it's a super interesting question.
Yeah.
One of the things that you'll see in the exhibit are attempts to extend it beyond the visual, but that leaves intact your question as to why it was the visual has been given such primordial importance. But there was a smell test that was made.
Auditory,
there was an auditory test which we have thanks to the B.F. Skinner archives, and ones that were involving all the senses. But Anne, what do you think?
Well, Freud thought that the unconscious spoke in pictures. And this is one reason why dreams, of course, become so important, and actually why psychoanalysts, and at least classically, weren't interested in talk, in words, in conversations that happened in dreams weren't important. There's the language, and there was discussion about how not, what words in dreams or spoken, conversation in dreams might mean, but really I think that might be, to the degree that it becomes a tool of psychoanalysis and a tool, an X-ray of the unconscious, that would probably, as a starting point, be where to look. This is also seen as the more primitive language. I'm not going to dominate this, and there may well be other. That would be my starting point to think about that. But I think there's more thoughts on the other side of the table. I think it's a great question.
Well, I'll say one thing, which is that having done these tests a lot, one time I was testing at bedside and realized that my TAT cards were not with me. And I had earlier in the previous week tested someone who was blind. And so when testing someone who was blind, I just basically gave the official descriptions of the cards and said, tell me a story about this. So this was completely informal and not really proper TAT, but then the TAT doesn't really have a scoring system, so it wasn't so bad. But I discovered with this person at bedside that this was someone who was retarded. And I said, okay, close your eyes, I want you to imagine a scene and tell me a story. I got much better stories from that person who was retarded than I would have gotten from the pictures. And I assume, and this is something I haven't researched, but I certainly did a number of times after that when someone was limited in I got better stories when I asked them to shut their eyes rather than show the stimuli themselves. So I think there's room for improvement, shall we say, or kind of thinking about this more, because I think we tend to assume people are concrete, but that's not necessarily all they have.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if I could flip that a little bit and just also say why, so the answers are primarily in language. Is there a concern over whether or not, are there other factors taken into account as well? Affect, body language, tone of voice, that kind of thing. I know that, for instance, ophthalmologists, when they're doing a vision test, they don't just listen to, yes, that one is, I can see better with this eye than the other, but also the delay in response. Just because in a lot of cases, the individual's assessment is not necessarily reliable. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that as well as just the other, not just the side in which the test is being administered, but the ways in which the answers are being interpreted.
Just a couple of thoughts on this issue. There are behaviors that are coded that are separate from the verbalizations, and some interpersonal behaviors get coded depending on the coding system, but the way in which a person interacts with the examiner can get coded, their behavior of how they're interacting with the cards on the stimuli material can get coded. This issue of verbal versus visual it's a very interesting one, and I think that some of the potency of the TAT and the Rorschach that we get comes from the fact that it requires a visual attribution, and there's a process where in creating that attribution, we're not seen as describing ourselves. Rather, we're describing what's out there. So we're telling the person who's listening to us about how we're organizing that information. And it's something that we don't typically do in a standardized context. And so that's the other feature of the test, is that they bring standardized stimuli to bear on this process of, okay, well, how do you construe a story to this stimulus relative to how everybody else construes a story to this stimulus? Or how do you go about organizing this visual stimuli and the meaning that you attribute to it relative to how other people do that? And so it's both a sort of a process of distancing oneself from one's productions. You know, many people really see the images as being not their own. You know, they are what exists in the stimulus, not what the person is putting on the stimulus. And in part, that experience makes the task unique, and I think it makes it clinically rich.
And just to add, people may not be aware of this, but when you do a Rorschach, you write down every single word that the person says. So it becomes a verbal test in addition to, and measures of thought disorder particularly are sensitive to that. That any odd thing that the person says, a redundancy, et cetera, it all gets scored. So that in fact, it's not just what one sees, but what one says about what one sees. So it's verbal in that way too.
I wonder about some misuse of the test by educators, because I was particularly struck by Rebecca's story, because when I was in the Southwest, I remember going to, and I had had some graduate work in projective tests, and was shocked when I went to Isla de Pueblo, to the school there, and found they had given draw a man test and had marked one boy as very low on the test intellectually because he had drawn the person in profile, and it was beautifully drawn. But he had only one eye, half a mouth, one nostril, and so on. And I said, "This is beautiful, sir. You know, this is a very intelligent boy." And the teacher was convinced that somehow that should be graded very low. And there were other cultural aspects to the draw a man tests that they hadn't taken into account and that were very distressing. And it seemed related to the fact that when I was a graduate student in psychology, the educational psychologists came over to take a few seminars on projective tests with us. And they were absolutely convinced that all the tests were absolute, that everything in the test was scientifically proven, including in the Rorschach, which of course is everybody, and as we were taught, was subject to question. And so it was a little unnerving to find that the educational psychologists were all taught in a much more rigid manner. This was in the late 50s, early 60s, so things have changed since then. But the ethical issue comes up there very certainly.
So I'm interested in the militarization of the test. I'm interested in the ways. I mean, I don't know a lot about the history except to know that it belongs there. The use of the Rorschach test on a quite widespread basis in the Second World War to try to weed out psychoneurotics or to identify people who are likely in one way or another to break down. The widespread interest during the war and post the war in things like fascist personalities or other kinds of personalities that might represent a danger to the Cold War era and to the need of the United States to maintain a democratic system. Down in the exhibition, you'll see, if you haven't seen it already, that there is a little discussion of the use of the Rorschach test to try to identify the Nazi personality. And troublingly, the discovery was made that they didn't seem to be very pathological, that they looked pretty intelligent and pretty normal, and that would have been probably a lot more reassuring if they had found some kind of Nazi personality, but they didn't. But I mean, again, I'm on this little bit of this shtick about what are some other histories that we could embed this technology into, and I do think part of the history of military psychology and the place in psychology in the Cold War, which is obviously something that Rebecca knows a lot about, would be another way of picking up on Peter's provocation. You know, what happens when it comes over here? What new histories does it get embedded in and entangled with?
I mean, one thing that strikes me is that if you were going to periodize the history of testing, I mean, two enormous punctuations in the story would be World War I, with the mass testing, mass intelligence testing, and so on, that had a huge effect on testing in the civilian sector in the period 1919 forward. And then one of the things that was most striking when we were looking at the archives here, the testing archives, and Marla and Rebecca and I were over there looking at this material, was that the heyday of these testings was in the years right after World War II. It was 46, 47, 48, 49. Not that the TAT was invented then, it comes back from the 30s and Rorschach from the 20s, but that's when you see the multiplication of these tests, specializations for children, for people that are blind, for people that, I mean, all of these specialized tests were, and we tried in the show to not just have Rorschach and TAT, but also to give some gestures towards the many variations of these tests that proliferated in that period. So I think that the period from 46 to 52, 53, and from 1919 to 1925, 26 are the civilian amplified echoes of a wartime periodization that takes place.
The Veterans Administration was the major trainer of clinical psychologists.
There you go. Yeah.
But there's an alternative story that the test was thriving in the 50s because the clinicians were so strong during World War II. So it's not necessarily that that it was just
professionalization.
Yeah. So there was an outbreak.
But they came out thinking that the lessons learned from the war were going to now be applied to.
I mean, the whole stuff that's happening in Minnesota around the MMPI was because the revival of the statistical versus clinical, and the kind of like worries about what is happening in the clinical setting.
I mean, here we see the integration into the broader history of science and technology. And if you look at the chemists after World War I, or the physicists after World War II, or James is studying the meteorologists, they come out of their role in setting the dates of the invasion of Europe and many other things was crucial in their claim to legitimacy in the years that followed the end of hostilities. So, I mean, here we begin to sort of see the material culture, and I would count these tests as part of the material culture of psychology, as part of the way we understand instruments and the professions more generally.
Siadmek, who did the film, was a Jewish immigrant from fleeing the Nazis, and I don't think that's an accident that he was kind of interested in all this subterfuge and who's who and how can we tell who's who and who's doing what and all that kind of stuff. I think that was very much a part and parcel of World War II in particular with so many secrets. So.
Greg was saying that these ink blots were not accidental, that they were tested and so on. So I thought, in terms of Anne placing it in the context of the occult, could this have been a very intentional thing to test like spirituality or attitudes towards spirituality? And this kind of dovetails with the war, right? I mean, and humanism after World War II, and sort of how do you? So I was just wondering, could that be a possibility? And what's the relationship between like psychological health and spirituality? Was it thought that if somebody was spiritual, they were somehow healthier psychologically at a certain point, or?
I actually think there was a very murky line between psychopathology and the supernatural, and that the hysterics, who in one context were degenerates, became in another context conduits to the spirit world, and they could kind of be, they were a little bit liminal in that way. And so people who were interested in psychopathology also often became interested in the spiritual and vice versa. I mean, in the spiritual. But this wasn't so much about using the test, I think, at least the issues that I was talking about, to see whether or not you had a healthy sort of relationship to the spiritual. That I think the idea about mental health and religion is a 20th century. We're now sort of moving beyond the Rorschach, a kind of a 20th century story about whether or not religion is good for mental health or actually conduces to mental ill health. And there's a lot of infighting among various psychologists and psychoanalysts about that. Psychoanalysis doesn't think much of religion traditionally. That's why
Unless
Jung
you're
is such
young.
a,
Unless you're young.
Unless you, well, so Jung, that's one of the reasons, you could say that's the big reason, Jung becomes the one who sort of reclaims the wooey for that whole movement and attracts people who are interested in the kinds of questions that you are raising.
But as far as I know, Rorschach himself never wrote about spirituality. And so it was not part of his vision of what the ink plots would be able to assess.
But some of the people who inspired him were very interested in those issues, like Justinus Kerner. So, I think there's probably more to be said than we have time to in this session. But